For more on the unfolding situation in Syria, we want to bring in Robert Ford. He's the last U.S. ambassador to Syria. He's now a Kissinger Fellow at Yale and a Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. Ambassador, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
What was your reaction to the missile strike last week?
I thought it was a very good thing to do. There's an international norm against using chemical weapons, and that dates back to after World War I. Assad has been flouting that with impunity, and this was the first time that the United States has tried to stop that use of chemical weapons and establish deterrence. It's a limited step, establishing deterrence, and I think it's good.
Ambassador, you were quoted as saying you resigned as the ambassador to Syria because you could no longer defend U.S. policy when it came to that country. What were your key concerns, and how do you see our position going forward?
I mentioned, for example, that Assad was using chemical weapons with impunity. We knew in late 2013 that he was using chlorine gas, despite the deal we had with the Russians and the United Nations that Assad would stop using chemical weapons. Chlorine gas, chemical weapon, was against that agreement. It was a violation. The Obama administration was doing nothing. The Obama administration did nothing to put pressure on Assad to negotiate. So the policy was going nowhere, not on the peace talks, not on chemical weapons, and I just was not going to defend it publicly any longer.
What was the breaking point for you when you were there?
More and more I realized that the president and I just didn't agree on where we wanted the Syria policy to go, and that he was prepared to live with a sort of an albatross of Syria, and I wasn't prepared to defend that kind of an approach.
That one strike, is that enough? Because
No.
The majority of the American people are wary about getting involved in another war in that part of the world where that might require a longer commitment. Is that one strike enough? And if not, what comes next?
So it won't be enough, because Assad, the nature of the way he operates is he'll lay low for a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two, and then he's going to start using chemical weapons again, chlorine gas or something else. Small scale, a little bit here, a little bit there. Test, see if there's an edge to the American envelope. And I think it'll be important to maintain deterrence that, again, we strike if he keeps doing it. I'm sure one of the messages that Secretary Tillerson is going to give to the Russians in Moscow is, if Assad does that again, we will strike again if we have to. That does not mean we're going to go to war in Syria. And by the way, we already have almost 1,000 soldiers in Syria anyway, fighting the Islamic State.
But Ambassador, here's the question, I guess. If we are intent on preventing him from using those chemical weapons, which is important, and the world has said that no one should use these things, but he continues to bomb his people with impunity with conventional weapons. He continues to carry out this assault on civilians. It's going on 6 years right now, more than 500,000 people killed. The president, like all Americans, said, look, he was moved by those images of those babies and the people that were wounded and killed during that attack, that chemical attack. But at the end of the day, he's got a travel ban in place that prevents refugees from escaping the horrors of war. He doesn't, at least right now, the conventional bombing has not moved him as much as the chemical weapons. So I guess I go back to my question, what's next?
Well, I would say we have to break a lot of these issues down. I wouldn't connect chemical weapons immediately to efforts to block Syrian refugees from coming to the United States. I think that's something we should be doing just because we should be doing it as part of an international effort. Just focus on the chemical weapons. For example, there are reports now that the Sudanese government has started using chemical weapons. Don't tell me that the Sudanese weren't watching Syria during 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016, and watching Assad get away with it and then saying, I bet we could do it too. I don't want to be in a situation where 3 or 4 years from now, U.S. forces are in some country somewhere and they face chemical weapons because the international agreement has already eroded so badly.
Good point.
So just stick to this one thing. Stop the use of chemical weapons. Then we have a different problem of the larger Syrian civil war. That's going to take an enormous effort to get Russia and Iran to drop their support for Assad and agree to a serious negotiation. How you put pressure on Iran, how you put pressure on Russia to do that is a whole nother topic.
So when you prioritize all of these things, and you're also looking at defeating ISIS on top of all of this as well, what is the number one priority for the Trump administration? Do you think it should be right now?
I think the Trump administration's number one priority has always been and still is fighting the Islamic State. And they've got a whole series of problems attached to that. Then the chemical weapons issue, which they can deal with at the same time, is a second priority issue. And that's a limited, distinct, discrete, really, thing that they can work on, just maintaining deterrence against Assad.
When I recall, Ambassador, when Bashar al-Assad came to power, a lot of people said he's much different man than his father was, who's a brutal dictator, Hafez al-Assad, and that he was going to be a modernizer. They also talked about him in the same tone that you hear them talk about King Abdullah of Jordan, and yet he's proven to be completely just like his father. You've met him. What's he like in person? And do you see him, if the idea's regime change, do you see him ever stepping down?
I've met him a couple of times back in 2011. I mean, he can be charming. I mean, he speaks fluent English. He studied medicine in Britain. But he's got his rough edges. He yelled at me when I raised human rights in our feast meeting. Yeah, he raised his voice. And the other thing about him is he just lies directly to your face. And it's unusual in my experience for foreign leaders to just lie. Usually if they don't agree, they'll either change the topic or they'll just say, we don't agree on this. Assad, by contrast, just lied. And so I think a lot of times when we see denials from the Syrian government in the media, remember that they don't tell the truth to begin with. Will he ever step down? I don't think he would ever step down unless he was compelled to do so because there was so much pressure on him. He won't do it because he's a nice guy. He's not a nice guy.
All right, former ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, thank you so much.
No, my pleasure.